artists around the world. Teaching artists around the world. Artists around the world. Teaching artists around the world.
Let us dive into our visiting artist today, the ever so amazing Imrie. Amber, oh my God. I was going to read your bio, but it's fairly extensive. So I'll just be I'm just going to give it a cursory thing and then let you present it in online RL.
Yeah.
Amber Imrie was born and raised off the grid in the Ozark Mountains of Northwest Arkansas. Largely homeschooled through her childhood, first attend public school consistently at the age of 12. She attended 3 years before testing out of high school, moving on to her own at age 16. Oh, look at this. This is like a rocker. Graduated honors at UC Berkeley in studio art, then MFA at Stanford University. Rival schools. She founded Venison Magazine, an online contemporary art magazine, and Camp Venison, an art micro residency. She has been an artist in residence and exhibited her work nationally and internationally. Her work explores rural life and Southern culture in the United States through a queer feminist lens as it intersects with gender, domestic life, class, and environmentalism. And it also is worth mentioning, she's an incredibly dynamic, profound, and kind force at the Alternative Arts School, and I couldn't have ever done anything without her incredible support. So thank you for being with us, Amber Imrie.
Thank you, Nato. What an introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share and take you guys back. We're going to kind of jump back in my practice to both my MFA and before MFA and follow those threads to current work that I'm currently working on in the studio. So you'll see some stuff in progress and some tests and different things that I'm really excited about and kind of where this has come about throughout my last about 12 years of making art. I was kind of a new person or old. I didn't make it to visual art for quite some time. I was 21 when I took my first art class at community college, and it was the same year I went to the first art museum. Grew up off the grid and didn't go to public school. So my influences early on were anything but in the contemporary art realm. So with that, jump over here. So back in grad school, I lost my mind a little bit and made this giant, large physical statement trying to tease out the different parts of life in rural America that I was trying to understand, and both how it intersected with my own journey and identity, and how this kind of spilled out in the community into bigger issues and systemic issues dealing with politics and economics and class. And gender. How do I? Why is that? There we go. There we go. And so this part is to say this is kind of how we're going to weave across these different parts of my practice. When I set up this physical statement, one of these walls really had to do a lot with our relationship with nature and the body being out in the natural space and kind of looking back at the body and how it kind of can be more of this feral animal in the natural space. And then there was one wall that really kind of encapsulated my own personal story and family stories and dialogues like that. And then another wall that really had to do with gender and politics and these big kind of systemic issues. And so these are the kind of three things that we'll be weaving in and out of in today's talk. But I want to start with this photograph that my father gave me just a few years ago. And he described it as the first photograph I ever took. And I remember the ramifications of this photograph, though I don't remember taking it because I was only about 2.5 when I took this photo. And I accidentally, made a somewhat good composition, and my dad was very proud of me. So we would often let me use his 35 millimeter camera to photograph. And one day he caught me taking a picture of my older sister popping a squat in our yard, peeing because we didn't have indoor plumbing. And I got in a lot of trouble, and my camera rights kind of gotten taken away from that. But during that time, I took quite a lot of different little pictures that I've now found in the family archive. And I am still fascinated with peeing in nature and this connection to the original forms our body would make in these natural spaces, and how this connects with gender identity in a post-binary dialogue. And I've been interested in the body for a while. So to take us back to when I was living in Los Angeles, I was thinking a lot about the rural body being in all of our kind of interactions with nature and the natural world being so commodified through capitalism, where every single moment we stepped outside was an opportunity to sell us some $500 walking poles and expensive shoes. And so I started to kind of think about what would the sexualization of the female form be if more being natural was the aesthetic we were trying to get through. So I made the suit called the Natural Suit and did an ad campaign for it, kind of advertising it as this cheap way that you can buy yourself into being an outdoors person and having these marks of being in the environment. During this time, we're gonna do quite a dynamic talk. I want to take you guys around and show you some videos and stuff too. Oh, okay. Maybe we won't watch that right now. That's getting confusing. I did this series doing cleaning up at nature, and was really interested in the domesticity of nature. So the way that, especially in California, I saw a lot of people going out into the parks and trying to clean them up as if they were internal spaces, and this kind of grooming and manicuring of nature, much like where we were inside. And it kind of blurred this line between the interior and the exterior, and where does the human live? Do they just live in the home, or do they live fully in the environment? So I did a series of actions on the land where I vacuumed and cleaned up nature as if it was an interior space. And when I was thinking a lot about home, I was also thinking about different insect homes and wildlife homes. And I made a couple of installations during this period of time. And this is one of them, making these hives and cocoons for different insects to live in. And inside of these cocoons is sound and lights and hand embroidered insects. And I welcomed people to put their head inside of them and to hear and see the insects, or interpretation of the insects up close. Home seems to be a very important thing to me, and bringing it back to the land again. And I made this part quilt, part shelter, speaking about or thinking about our connection with the land, in particular back to landers or survivalists, preparers, thinking of this kind of culture that is embedded in rural America, and also the place of the gun in these cultures. When I made this piece, I was in my MFA program, and a lot of the dialogue that I was hearing from people in my cohort and around me, their depictions and idea of like who lived in the South and why they had guns was very one-sided and stereotyped to the people that I knew who lived in these areas and had these guns. And so these guns that we see in the foreground here, I made them from taking a cast and then wool felting it and making, I actually have one here, these malleable, floppy guns. And it was to represent the way that the culture here really sees the gun as these rifles that are passed down in family and become almost members of the family. And so I wanted them to have this body-like feel. And so they have the same weight as a gun because they're made out of a casted rubber. And then they're wool felted, so they're really soft, and they're also really harmless. And so I wanted to try and take this and put it into the visual language, which these families often attribute to a very hard, cold, and destructive mechanism. So this now kind of thread that we've pulled from my past, I'm super interested in hunting culture and how it relates to camouflage and the overlapping of camouflage with queer identity, and wanting to both, hide oneself in the world, or to stand out through this act of camouflage, either with the camouflage blending in with your environment, or the juxtaposition of that camouflage in, say, a urban environment. And so I've done a lot of playing around with this, and this is a place that we're stepping kind of into the work in progress studio here of how I've been thinking about this idea of camouflage. And I made a suit out of camo and swam around in a pool to experiment with how this could play with light and body in space. So this is a place that I'm really excited to dig more into and work more with in the next coming years. One thing that often comes up for me is the term redneck. As a young kid growing up in the South, I did not identify with the term redneck, but it was often attributed to me. A lot of poor whites in the South are called rednecks, though even if they don't identify with certain aspects of redneck culture. And so this is a piece, it's a photograph of a queer friend of mine who has also grown up being called redneck. And I had him over one day and saw that he had dyed his armpits pink. And I thought it was just this fantastic little metaphor for the way that queerness lives in the South, and that how it grows in the most unlikely places and thrives. And so I wanted to take this photo image of this little pit of pink and really pull it out and expand upon it. With redneck, you can't get away from this duality in the South between pride and shame. And that has both personal connections and also a huge implications on the way that people intake information, especially from the coastal cities, of, are we going to be prideful of who we are in the South, or are we going to feel ashamed of our history? And these two massive feelings clash together. And I can see an individual, when they're faced with one of their born-held beliefs being challenged, either the decision to be shameful or to reject the idea and become prideful. And so I've made a couple of pieces both about my own pride and shame of the South, and I'm exploring this more in more future works. But this piece comes from my MFA, my time in my MFA, and it says on the stitched into the sleeping bag, "I've been so ashamed, I have not told anyone, but when I was 12 years old, I peed my bed. I mean, by my bed, I mean the back seat of my car, my mother's car where we were living at the time." And it's particularly a piece about the shame of experiencing homelessness as a child in the United States, and how that shame in myself sat more with the act of peeing the bed and not the act of being homeless and therefore not having a reliable place to go to the bathroom and being in the position where you pee your bed. So these themes of redneck has come up again and again, and I thought I'd share with you just a 3-minute clip of the piece that I made last year called Redneck. So that's a little sample of this piece, Redneck, that is a newer work. Another video piece that I've been working on from the same kind of thread of looking into redneck culture and lower income culture in particularly the South, but also across rural America and rural places all over the world. I've really realized there's a lot of commonalities between the ways that they both struggle and thrive in the natural environment, more removed from the systemic supports that we have in urban centers. And so this piece, Bootstrapped, is one that I just finished up, and I have queued a little short clip of it for us to watch. Yeah. So in this piece, the premise was to fall down on the ground, and I could only get back on my feet by using the pulling of my bootstraps to find a way to get back up. So it took quite some time to get back up. I fell down many times. Oops, that's the wrong thing. And eventually I get back on my feet. And if you have interest in seeing the full piece, it's 18 minutes long, and I'm happy to share it with anyone here who would like to see it. Just reach out. So we're going to go way back in time to 2014 real quickly, because we're about to jump into some of the work that I do using photography, interacting with threads and textiles. And I think it's interesting. I don't know. I've thought about this just recently of where did this really come from? Looking back on my short career in art, and going back to 2014, I was doing embroidery of different imagery from the South, and also kind of taking from, I was looking at a lot of like textile tapestry work coming out of Europe and antiquated stuff, like at the museums, and kind of relating this imagery of the stitch and the kind of romanticism of these outdoors to more contemporary scenes. So I was doing embroideries and other little textile pieces depicting these rural places with the stacked tires and the guns in this kind of format that was visually speaking to a history of kind of stitch work and women's work historically. And from that, I started to kind of think of like what would happen if the embroidery was able to like really expand and spill into the environment. And this went in two different directions. And I did some installation work. And then I also started to re-engage with my photography practice and print these photos onto textiles and stitch into them in various ways. And returning back to the home again and the abundance of the environment and how it kind of swallows us up and our interaction with it through this medium. And also how we destroy it and bring it down, but how it's resilient to us. And our shame about our treatment of the environment and how we're trying to almost outrun and escape the tidal wave of destruction that our actions have created. And also how we restrict ourselves from the environment. So this piece, Contraband, I stole rocks from national parks across America that were laying in the parking lot because a lot of the parking lots were made out of gravel. And in national parks, all the rocks are protected. But my question was, is the gravel that is used and we drive on, why aren't these rocks protected too? What is the significance and the difference between one rock to another if they just sit a few feet away? So I collected rocks from the parking lots of national parks and then wrapped them to make them precious. And this kind of practice of wrapping and making precious from that project spilled over into a studio ritual that I still upkeep, like collecting little artifacts from nature on my walks with my dog, and then wrapping them in thread when I get back to the studio. And these can be anything from natural things to things that we as humans have left in the forest and has become one with nature. And so on the left, you see a table chair, or maybe it's either a part of a table or a part of a chair. And I quite liked that once I wrapped it, it looked almost like this gun again. And here's a piece kind of going back to the culture of rural communities and how they come together. I took this photograph at a gathering of people in Southwest Missouri. And after living in urban places for so long, I had almost forgotten the ways that we would invite people to somebody's land, and that land becomes a site of a party and of happenings and experiences and culture that is embedded right into the environment, and the importance of that and how that transforms these natural spaces and interacts with them. And the queer identities out in these natural spaces. This photograph is taken in the home of my chosen family aunts who lived up the road from us in Northwest Arkansas. And they still live there in that home. But in the South, you can't get away from the churches. I think in any Bible Belt, it is a very strong and constant pressure here to either be a part of a church or to leave. And so as a child growing up outside of an organized religion, very much based, our spirituality was very much based in Eastern and alternative medicines. And so when I was growing up in the South to kind of get by and not be bullied too much in school, I would often say I was between churches as a way of skirting the question of what church I went to. And these churches became part of the way that I'm both thinking about my queer identity in the South and also just life in the South, the way it intertwines into everybody's homes here. And this piece I made, it's called The Weight of All These Secrets. And I made this from taking stitching onto water-soluble fabric and then dipping it into water. And these little words and confessions that I would stitch out then became abstracted through the purification process of dipping it into water. So I was thinking about this bucket as this little quasi church of purification for these queer confessions and what that would become afterwards. So recently, I'm still interested in queerness and the church's role in that. So all last year, when living in the Åland Islands, I did prayer sessions for homophobic people across the world, praying that they might find a way to let queerness into their heart. And so I did these in the natural space, very much co-opting the dialogue of the traditional church and bringing it into an environment in a way that made more sense for myself. And that's about it. I wanted to just end on this breached image. This piece, I think I see it more as a portrait than as anything else of how my head is just still stuck in this earth place that I came from. And it's, you know, hard to pull myself out of that. So that's a lot where my work comes from. So, yeah.
Give it up for Amber Imrie. Thank you, Amber. So great. I'll kick off with questions, but then please, folks, either use the chat. I like it. Raise your hand or something. Ask some questions or thoughts or reactions. But I'll start with something so basic, which is obviously art is a great way to get to know someone. But for you, because your work is so biographic and you are you are both the subject as well as performer, all the more so. You know, how is that for you? You know, that can be a gift and a curse at times, because of course it's both vulnerable, but it also puts a lot of pressure on you to be the subject. Has that evolved over time? And how do you feel about you as the constant, you know, source of the kind of your work in a way?
It's a good question. I think that's a hard one to ask too, because I think I've always been a storyteller, and I've always told stories about my life, because I think as soon as my parents had me in the place and the time that they had me in, they kind of set me off on a unusual story. And at any time I would mention a fragment of my life, people would kind of latch on and want to learn more. And so I've always been in the position of telling stories from my life. And it's been something that I think that I really grew up doing a lot of. And so when I started making art, it naturally just kind of fit in that's the stories that I would tell. Because I think that I would get interested in how this dealt with a systemic issue or fit into culture or dealt with psychology. But the reason of why I got to that point was a story, and people seemed very interested in that story as well. And so naturally over time, through encouragement and through just people's reaction, that story has become a more and more important part of that dialogue. And I think in my most recent work is becoming more and more part of just my life, of the art kind of infusing itself there.
Thanks so much, Amber. Allison, go ahead, chime in.
Hi, Amber. I just feel such an affinity for your work. I'm not sure whether it's the materiality or just the willingness to get your own guts out. I mean, I think I do a little of that myself, but I'm really intrigued by your latching onto the pride versus shame equation. And I'm thinking about, you know, how does that line move? You know, if you toggle back and forth between the two, and I'm just interested in that as a process and less than a statement. Do you have anything to say about that?
I think it's totally a process, and I think it's muddy. I think that you can feel prideful and shameful about the exactly same thing. And I feel both prideful and ashamed of being and coming from where I came from and all the complexities of what it means when you're born in the South. I think a lot of people, especially in America, understand this tension between the Northern coastal elites and the Southern states. And as you might even hear, my accent is mostly erased because of the bullying I encountered once I left the South and entered the public school system in California. People would assume that I was mentally slow because of my accent. And that first became shameful, and I would hide my accent. And now, living back in the South for the first time in over 20 years, I'm realizing that accent is coming back, and I'm quite proudful of when it does start to peek through, because that is just my culture that I came from. And while it is problematic, like many of our cultures are, there's also a lot of complexity to these stereotypes that we hold about individuals and place.
Yeah, it's the judgment piece, like whether it's self-judgment or responding to judgment. Did you ever whip out your accent as a tool just to blow people?
Oh, anytime I call anyone here, like, okay, like I'm gonna call and pay my trash away bill. And when I call the trash away, I'll be like, oh, hey.
Hey, y'all.
I'll get right into it. As soon as I hear their accent, that my Southern accent definitely comes out.
Well, I'm just gonna keep paying attention to what you're doing. It's really wonderful to see.
So much, Allison.
Thanks, Allison. Who else? Someone to join in. Oh, there you go. Danielle.
Hi, thank you, Amber, for your talk. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to chime in with a recognition. I was born and raised in the South. You hear that my accent is almost gone. I grew up in Atlanta, or on the east side of Atlanta is what I say, so that people are like, oh, east side of Atlanta. But I now live in Michigan, and what I've found, I've lived here for almost 10 years, and what I found is that there's like willful misrepresentation of what the South is. Like, people really hold dearly on to these biases and these, I can't tell you how many times I've gotten comments such as like, oh, you're from the South, I'm sorry, I would never go past the Mason-Dixon line. Oh, aren't you all racist? And it's just, and what I think is happening is that othering allows people up here to feel safer, that they're somehow less responsible for the atrocities in the United States because they're in Michigan and not Georgia. Mm-hmm. So I just wanted to thank you for talking about it. And I definitely whip out the y'all as much as I can now. Sometimes I will lay it on thick, but anyway, so thank you for your talk.
Thank you. I love the word y'all. And I actually was in a conversation with the person whose pink pit I photographed just the other day. He's a good friend of mine, Aaron Elam. And we were talking about it. And he grew up queer in the South. And he was saying that every time he hears y'all, he gets prickly. Like, he's like, oh my gosh, this is going to be somebody I'm not going to agree with. This is going to be somebody who's going to be homophobic. And I was telling him, or speaking with him about that we should co-opt and reclaim y'all, because it's a gender neutral, a non-binary, genderless you all, and it is a beautiful word, and we should use it more in our culture, because from all of the time I spent in California, I have a horrible habit of saying you guys and calling usually a room full of women and non-binary people men, and that is in and of itself problematic, and I think y'all is a fantastic alternative. So please spread the word, y'all.
All right, y'all. Cloudy.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Amber. That was I've never seen your work like so close. So I really, really, really loved it. I loved how you created like this whole image of a cultural image. I mean, although you speak about your, personal life, but this whole image of the church and the gun and the peeing, I think it's all creating like this, cultural statement. And so I have several questions. I hope I can get it all together in, but I was thinking, one thing that I was thinking is knowing about your experience in the Scandinavian countries, in what was that in Sweden? Mm-hmm. How much of the I don't know, I want to ask you how much of a connection was there, because from your work, so there's such a connection between that experience and in Arkansas. I don't know, I thought it was so different countries, but they don't look so different the way you bring them together. I don't know, does that make sense? There's a lot of Scandinavian in your work. Maybe that's what I want to say.
Yeah, so like, and I filmed pieces in Åland Islands, Finland, which is a very interesting location. It is neither Sweden nor Finland. It is a semi-autonomous region that is somewhat owned by Finland. And if you go through immigration and different things, you go through Finnish immigration, but they speak Swedish. And they are positioned just 2 hours off the coast of Sweden in the Åland Island kind of region of the Baltic Sea. Very interesting place. And what I was really amazed by my time over the last 4 years, I lived in 4 different countries, mostly across Europe. And I was really surprised to find that even on the Åland Islands, you find stacks of old tires sitting in the middle of the forest, and you find people living very similar rural lives than you find in Northwest Arkansas. And I think there is this commonality to the way that we interact in the land, but there are differences that you see that come from more the structures of society in these different places. And so one of the things that I was really interested in between my time in Åland Islands, Finland, and in Sweden is they're just 2 hours apart, but they have one very important law that's different. Sweden takes tax dollars and makes it completely free to throw things away. So when you walk into Swedish nature, it is hard to find trash. A lot of that trash is picked up and thrown away. And if you have an old car on your property, you just pay, or you just call them up and they come and pick it up and haul it off and correctly dispose of it or donate it to charity. And the Åland Islands, which is just 2 hours away, they don't have this law. And you find the same things that you find in the Northwest Arkansas and across America, of these old trash piles in the middle of the woods, of the ways that people have been unable to pay to haul away their trash. So they've left it on the land and stacked it up around themselves. And it becomes these like old, memories from families that used to live there in bygone eras. And so it was interesting for me to find both the commonalities in the culture of Northwest Arkansas to these other rural places, but also maybe find some of the reasons, these systemic reasons of why these actions are taking place and why people are reacting in this way with the land in their domestic homes. Did that answer your question? I don't know. I went on a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a broad conversation, but yeah, partly, yeah, for other people. But I'm also thinking about the guns. I was thinking, what are you thinking about Joseph's boys when you were making them? With the felt and everything, and the survival instinct of what it was so interesting. But yeah.
Well, listen, yeah, certainly the guns have a Boycean vibe. It's not fair. What, does Boyce get to own felt? I guess. I don't know. Whatever. How many artists get to own a material? Suprio, come in. And then Sophia, your hand was up and then it was down, but we'll go to Suprio, and if you want to come back, come back. Suprio.
Hello, first of all, I love the works. Really, one thing that I can see each and every work, you're exploring different layers of identity. Like sometimes it's geographical identity, sometimes it's gender identity, sometimes just being a natural being, you're going to nature, collecting material. So I want to know a little bit more about your idea of this identities and how you are seeing these different layers and how you explore it through your works or material.
I love that question. I think that I think this comes from really a deep dive into like, who the hell am I? And like, what world do I live in? And what is this world? And who are all the people that surround me? I'm extremely interested in both psychology and in anthropology and the ways that people have lived and thought. And I think that comes out in the ways that I approach my work in different ways. But going back to my 21-year-old very first art class, in one of my very first projects, made a piece about my identity and being like, I was at the time just had found out that my family was Polish, and I didn't know this because my mom had changed her last name because she grew up in a Polish community in Chicago and was really bullied for being Polish. So as soon as she could change her last name and get rid of her Polish identity, she did. And she never told us growing up that she grew up around a lot of Polish culture and her mom spoke Polish in the home. And so finding this out as a young adult, that there was all this history that was just erased because of this stereotype, really got me interested in both investigating my own personal identity, but also how do people build their identity and what are the different factors that go into this, especially through our lifetime, which becomes more and more complex with each place we live or each kind of role that we incorporate into ourselves.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Sophia, jump on in.
Well, I just wanted to say that I feel like there's so much bravery and sincerity in your work, and not just about things that are easy to be brave about because they're currently on trend, like talking about the identity of like redneck, whether it's taken, whether it's chosen or it's placed upon oneself, and being without, unhoused, and the shame of those experiences, I feel like is just very, very visceral and meaningful and intense. And I really appreciate the way that you continue to like work through the materials. I know this has already been said, but thinking about like spending a lot of time outdoors myself as a kid and just the incredible boredom, and then also the like observations that you make when you have like basically just dirt and rocks and woodsy stuff around. And then I just really enjoyed seeing the things that you created, seeing these objects through your eyes, through your hands, through your touch, and the way that whether it was like I really loved the piece with the pine needles and then the branches were covered with thread. And then I really loved the queerness of threads spilling out from the photographs. I just felt like there was so much thought and gentleness, and the threads kind of brought a tactility to the photographs, or these like hard objects that gave a lot of extra meaning that I really appreciated. And I guess finally, I just want to say I really got pleasure out of the bouncy floppy guns that are like phallic, and then they're like floppity, they're all flaccid and ridiculous and humorous, like all genitals are in a way, yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. I think humor is really important in my work, and especially when you're talking about things like, being a redneck or growing up with food insecurities and not having a bathroom and various things like this, that it oftentimes can feel too heavy and too dark. And as a child, I would also often go to humor as a way of dealing with trauma or difficulties. And I think that in my work, it's still very important. And I think that I like to engage humor to kind of both lighten the mood, but also remind us that this is all things that we have constructed in our society. And like guns, like we made this thing and now we're like, don't know what to do with it. And it means these different things to different people in our culture. And I just think that it's all a bit funny, isn't it?
Well, listen, Amber, everybody, thank you. Let's give it up for Amber Imrie. Thank you so much, Amber.
Thank you all.
It's a true pleasure to see the work. Everybody, feel free to come back to our next Visiting Artists lecture. Next week, we have Dmitry Velinsky from Stodelit, who literally fled St. Petersburg, Russia, because the police raided their home and they fled and are currently on the run in Berlin. So they're an incredible communist, still staunchly communist, not Putin-friendly group. I've loved them, and they also run their own school of socially engaged art from a Leninist perspective. They are brilliant. They are playwrights, theatrical people in a truly avant-garde tradition. And so we get to hear from some truly Russian avant-garde artists on the run next week. Amber, thank you for the incredible work you do. And thank you to all the great questions and thoughts and comments from all of you. Looking forward to seeing you all again. Thanks so much.
Thank you all.
Artists around the world, teaching artists around